2 billion rand systematically vanished from a bank meant for the poorest savers, while millions of landless citizens remain trapped in squalid rented hostels with nothing to show a new elite thrives. Step forward, Julius Malema, a leader shouting for radical economic emancipation from the podium while draped in ultra-luxury. If power changes hands but not structural reality, has anything truly changed? Do not look away. What comes next may change how we read the map. If you believe in these structural truths, give us your like, leave your thoughts, and subscribe to continue this journey together with South African dynamics. This is the modern theatre of South African politics, where populist anger acts as a lucrative currency. For over a decade, the economic freedom fighters have promised to tear down the historic fences of economic apartheid. Yet beneath the red berets and the fierce anti-capitalist speeches lies a deep structural paradox. Today we peel back the performance to examine the real ledger of accountability. We ask whether the loudest voice for the poor is truly a champion of truth, or merely a political actor masterfully manipulating the pain of a nation. To understand the meteoric rise of the economic freedom fighters, one must first confront the unresolved trauma of the South African landscape. For over 3 decades since the dawn of democracy in 1994, the promise of equitable land redistribution has remained a distant mirage. Step outside the gleaming skyscrapers of Sandton and journey into the sprawling, overcrowded settlements where millions of black South Africans still live as tenants on the very soil their ancestors farmed. According to official land audit data, a staggering historical disparity persists. Less than 10% of the population historically controls over 70% of the nation's commercial agricultural land. This profound structural failure is not merely a statistical anomaly, it is an open wound. It is the fuel that feeds a raging fire, creating a volatile social landscape where economic desperation can easily be weaponized by a skilled political orator. On the public stage, Julius Malema commands this grievance with unparalleled theatrical brilliance. Dressed in the iconic red overalls and beret of the working class, his voice thunders through stadiums, capturing the deep-seated anger of the disenfranchised. He stands before crowds of thousands, telling them that they are foreigners in their own country because they possess no title deeds, no assets, and no generational wealth. His rhetoric is sharp, designed to slice through complex economic realities and deliver simple, visceral targets for public frustration. Yet a troubling contradiction emerges within this political theatre. While his party champions a grand vision of Pan-African solidarity across the continent, his street-level messaging frequently pivots toward a more dangerous exclusionary nationalism. In recent years, local communities have witnessed a sharp rise in anti-migrant sentiment, where foreign African nationals from nations like Zimbabwe and Ghana are blamed for the lack of employment and the stagnation of public services. This shifting narrative highlights the core vulnerability of the current South Africa crisis, where systemic economic gridlock is re-engineered into localized tribalism and xenophobic friction. In regions like KwaZulu-Natal, informal micro-vendors are driven from the streets by mobs acting under the banner of local preservation, while the true architects of economic inequality remain untouched. For the elderly viewer watching from across the Atlantic, this dynamic mirrors historical patterns where populism exploits genuine suffering to build a fortress of personal influence. In this high-stakes political drama, radical language becomes the mask, a beautifully crafted, emotionally charged shield worn to conceal the complex realities of governance and the transactional nature of modern political power. It projects a flawless illusion of revolutionary purity to the masses, convincing the poorest citizens that their salvation lies in total systemic disruption. The mask allows a leader to channel the legitimate fury of a mother living in a rented hostel room into a consolidated voting bloc. It transforms deep economic despair into a potent political currency, giving the illusion that a simple change in ownership will instantly resolve generations of systemic neglect. For over 10 years, this performance has kept the economic freedom fighters at the absolute center of national discourse, framing every legislative debate around their radical agenda. But a performance, no matter how spectacular, eventually faces the cold scrutiny of reality. When the lights dim and the stadium empties, the ledger of truth demands an audit. The grand illusion of a selfless revolution begins to crack under the weight of financial investigations. But what happens when the man who promises to smash the system is found to be quietly feeding from its very veins? The peak of the political drama arrives when the financial veneer of the populist movement is stripped away by investigative audits. For years, the economic freedom fighters projected an image of absolute financial transparency, claiming to be completely untainted by the historic corruption plaguing the ruling party. However, the spectacular collapse of VBS Mutual Bank shattered this narrative, entirely exposing a dark underbelly of systemic greed. Almost 2 billion rand, the life savings of impoverished rural widows' burial societies and local municipal funds, was systematically siphoned off through a web of fraudulent transactions. This was a devastating assault on the poorest citizens of Limpopo, who queued for days in the scorching heat, only to find their bank accounts completely empty. While elderly pensioners wept on the pavement outside the locked doors of the failed institution, a parallel reality unfolded within the upper echelons of the radical left. Investigative files revealed that millions of rand from this stolen treasury found its way into a private corporate entity known as Mahuna Investments. On paper, this firm belonged to a relative of the leadership, but independent financial audits exposed its true function as a personal political slush fund. The siphoned loot was tracked to high-end boutiques, funding a life of extraordinary luxury. Stolen capital was converted into designer apparel, private school tuition, and elite security details. This represents the ultimate betrayal of the working class, proving that stadium rhetoric was merely a transaction to fund an ultra-luxury lifestyle in Hyde Park, Sandton, Africa's wealthiest square mile. This is not reform. This is not rhetoric. This is accountability. The public reaction across South Africa was a mixture of profound outrage and deep betrayal. The party leadership aggressively dismissed the charges as a coordinated smear campaign orchestrated by a white monopoly capital. However, persistent demands for criminal prosecution have destabilized their standing, making it a critical focus in Malema latest news. The wheels of justice may turn slowly, but the demand for transparency remains unyielding. The image of the Julius Malema Chameleon solidified in the minds of analytical observers who watched a leader transition from championing the landless poor to relaxing in gated mansions funded by the plundered savings of those very same citizens. Before we reveal the next chapter, which is perhaps the most powerful assertion of political hypocrisy you will ever hear, I want to pause and speak directly to you. If this channel has moved you, if these stories are touching something deep in your spirit, then consider becoming a member. Not for exclusive perks, but because supporting this channel is directly supporting narratives that mainstream media refuses to tell. Every membership is a vote for South African Dynamics' mission to bring unvarnished truth to light. As judicial investigations into the VBS Mutual Bank scandal deepen, the legal net continues to tighten around the political elite. The defense that these funds were legitimate consulting fees has collapsed under the weight of forensic cross-examinations. This systemic looting has severely damaged the moral authority of the populist platform, leaving millions of voters disillusioned by the blatant hypocrisy of their self-proclaimed liberators. This is the tragic climax of a movement that traded the genuine aspirations of a suffering people for the immediate comforts of material wealth. The modern electorate is no longer blinded by charismatic theatricality. They are demanding a complete overhaul of the political landscape. This internal crisis has permanently altered the balance of domestic power, forcing the radical movement onto a defensive footing. Yet the economic betrayal of the poor was only the first layer of a much larger global political game. Bạn có đồng ý với nội dung bổ sung hoàn chỉnh của phần này không? The immediate fallout of this ideological warfare is felt not in the air-conditioned corridors of Parliament, but on the unforgiving streets of South Africa's townships. When political leaders employ inflammatory language, the socio-economic friction on the ground quickly intensifies. What begins as high-level anti-migrant rhetoric rapidly transforms into a brutal, localized reality. Across provinces like KwaZulu-Natal, the consequences have been devastating for ordinary citizens and informal traders alike. Vulnerable street vendors trying to scrape together a living in a stagnant economy find themselves targeted by organized violence and intimidation campaigns. This fracturing of local solidarity reveals a dangerous truth about populist strategies. They often ignite fires that the leaders themselves cannot control, or perhaps have no intention of extinguishing. While regional migrants from neighboring nations like Zimbabwe and Ghana bear the initial brunt of this hostility, the chaos inevitably shifts inward. History shows that xenophobia is a slippery slope that frequently degenerates into deep-seated tribalism and bitter internal division. In this volatile environment, the very fabric of social cohesion begins to unravel. The vulnerable are pitted against the vulnerable, competing for scarce resources, while the political architects of these divisions remain completely insulated from the fallout. This destructive pattern is precisely how EFF Populism Exposed reveals its true cost, demonstrating that the real victims of radical rhetoric are always the ordinary people left to survive in the wreckage of broken communities. Pause for a moment and share with us where you are watching this video. Is it from Africa, from Europe, from the Americas, or from a small village whose name deserves to be spoken aloud? Tell us, because every place matters. South African Dynamics wants to thank you personally and to send a wish across the distance. May freedom and dignity walk beside you wherever you are. Let the comments be not just words, but bridges of solidarity. The civilian toll of this unchecked populism goes far beyond temporary civil unrest. It inflicts long-term damage on the domestic economy and internal security framework. When microeconomies are disrupted by violence, local supply chains break down, driving up food costs and deepening the hunger of the poorest families. This economic paralysis further weakens a state already struggling with systemic electricity crises and soaring unemployment rates. Yet, the political elite continue to exploit these crises for electoral gain, offering superficial promises instead of sustainable policy solutions. For an older generation of viewers who witnessed the global struggles for civil rights, this exploitation of genuine economic pain for personal power feels tragic. It illustrates a bitter paradox. The rhetoric of liberation is weaponized to maintain a state of permanent instability, trapping the working class in a cycle of desperation while shielding the wealthy from accountability. The domestic stability of South Africa is now hanging by a thread, caught between structural economic stagnation and the escalating demands of radical political movements. As local municipal structures fail to provide basic services, the legitimacy of the entire democratic architecture is called into question. The gap between the lifestyle of the political class and the daily struggle of the citizen creates a profound sense of betrayal. This environment is ripe for further exploitation, as factional battles within the political landscape threaten to fracture the country along ethnic and regional lines. The true tragedy of modern South African politics is that the noble pursuit of economic justice has been hijacked by a transactional elite. As internal chaos deepens, foreign superpowers are quietly recalculating their investments in South Africa's fragile stability. The global ramifications of this internal political friction extend far beyond the borders of the African continent. In Washington, Brussels, and London, foreign policy analysts and economic strategists are closely monitoring the trajectory of South Africa populism. The radical rhetoric of the economic freedom fighters, particularly their unyielding demand for the expropriation of land and private property without compensation, has sent ripples of anxiety through international financial markets. For Western policymakers, South Africa is not just another regional economy, it is the geostrategic anchor of the entire sub-Saharan region. If the nation's constitutional framework fractures under populist pressure, the stability of the Southern African development community could collapse, triggering a massive refugee and economic crisis across the hemisphere. Bilateral trade agreements, most notably the African Growth and Opportunity Act, hang precariously in the balance. United States diplomats have repeatedly raised quiet concerns regarding the rule of law and the protection of foreign direct investments. The international community views the domestic debate not as a simple case of historic redress, but as a critical choice between long-term economic integration and isolationist decay. This geopolitical tension brings us face to face with a profound global dilemma. If wealth grows but inequality deepens, who is development really for? For decades, international conglomerates have extracted vast resources from the continent, leaving local populations to bear the environmental and social costs, while capital flees to offshore accounts. This systemic imbalance provides fertile soil for radical movements to challenge the legitimacy of the entire post-apartheid settlement. Yet the response from global bodies like the African Union and the European Union remains complex. While there is deep sympathy for the historic necessity of comprehensive land reform, there is equal dread regarding the chaotic methods proposed by populist leaders. The international lens exposes the sharp contrast between accountability versus impunity, forcing a clear distinction between genuine economic justice and opportunistic political theater. Foreign markets respond instantly to political instability, and the mere threat of systemic disruption has already weakened the national currency, making imports more expensive for the ordinary citizen. The high-ranking politicians who deliver fiery speeches against foreign imperialism rarely suffer from these economic shifts. It is the working class that pays the ultimate price. This growing dissatisfaction among the electorate has fundamentally altered the geopolitical landscape, drawing the attention of global news networks and intelligence agencies alike. As international pressure mounts, Malema now faces an existential trap on his own home soil. The shifting tides of the 2026 political landscape have fundamentally transformed the ground beneath Julius Malema's feet. For years, the economic freedom fighters operated as the undisputed kings of radical disruption, capitalizing on the slow pace of economic transformation. However, the unexpected political resurrection of former President Jacob Zuma and the meteoric rise of his Umkhonto weSizwe party have shattered this monopoly on populist anger. The Umkhonto weSizwe party has aggressively cannibalized the support base of the Red Berets, systematically peeling away working-class voters who have grown weary of purely theatrical performances. Recent electoral assessments indicate a stark decline, forcing the national support of the economic freedom fighters well below 10%. This dramatic contraction has pushed the populist movement into a dangerous strategic corner, where its very survival depends on a desperate recalibration of its political identity. As the voter base shrinks, the intense legal and public scrutiny surrounding the Malema Wealth Scandal continues to erode his revolutionary legitimacy. The stark juxtaposition between fighting for the poor and maintaining a highly transactional relationship with elite financial networks has become impossible for the public to ignore. In this existential battle for relevance, the house of cards built on fiery rhetoric is facing its ultimate stress test. To arrest this decline, the populist leadership faces a critical dilemma. They must either escalate their radical rhetoric to unprecedented levels or risk total political irrelevance. The path forward demands an authentic shift toward institutional governance, proving that true economic liberation requires structured, sustainable delivery. The modern electorate is increasingly demanding tangible progress, demonstrating a growing understanding that a resilient nation is built on concrete outcomes, not promises, not speeches policy. The struggle for survival is no longer just about legislative influence. It is a desperate fight to remain within arm's reach of the seat of power. Without the patronage networks and state machinery that accompany political leverage, a radical movement can easily fade into the margins of history. The road ahead for South Africa is fraught with uncertainty as these competing populist factions battle for the soul of the disenfranchised, threatening to split the political landscape into deeply fractured regional fiefdoms. As we prepare to reveal the final verdict, remember this is not the end of the road, but a seed planted in the soil of your understanding. If you want to see this harvest of truth grow, subscribe to our channel. Let this be the road we walk together, the light we carry forward. Your subscription is your commitment to walk with us into the next chapter of Africa's unfolding destiny. Subscribe now and stand ready. The illusions are dissolving, leaving South Africa to face its ultimate hour of truth. The modern history of South Africa stands at a critical crossroad, where the illusions of theatrical politics can no longer mask systemic economic failure. True emancipation cannot be constructed upon the ruins of plundered community banks, nor can it be achieved through hyper-nationalist rhetoric, carefully designed to shield personal fortunes. As we have documented through the unvarnished facts of recent investigations, the gap between revolutionary speeches and financial reality has grown too wide to ignore. The narrative of the Julius Malema Chameleon has finally collided with the unyielding ledger of structural truth, forcing a profound awakening across the global electorate. For an older generation of viewers who have dedicated their lives to the global struggle for civil rights and systemic justice, this moment brings a mixture of deep indignation and profound regret. It remains deeply painful to witness the noble aspirations of a disenfranchised population weaponized for individual gain. Yet within this structural collapse lies the seed of a more resilient, hopeful future. The decline of hollow populism paves the way for an authentic political consciousness, one that values genuine institutional policy over performative outrage. With EFF Populism exposed to the harsh light of public scrutiny, the citizens of South Africa are beginning to reclaim the true definition of sovereignty and dignity. They are moving past the era of the captivating orator demanding absolute accountability from those who seek to lead. Ultimately, the destiny of this great nation belongs not to a single charismatic actor, but to the collective will of its working class. As the political chess pieces shift into 2026, the demand for clean, transparent governance grows stronger every single day. The era of the Julius Malema Chameleon may be drawing to a definitive close, but the march toward real economic equity continues with renewed clarity and pride. We leave you with one final question to ponder as we close this chapter. If power changes hands, but not structure, has anything really changed?